Welcome. I'm Brian Lehrer. Our special guest tonight, philosopher, public intellectual, author, activist, and Bernie Sanders supporter, Dr. Cornel West. But first, last night's GOP debate, and what a difference from the previous one 5 weeks ago. That was before the ground started shaking, before the terrorist attacks in Paris and California, before Donald Trump suggested barring Muslims from entering the country, before Dr. Ben Carson's fall and failure to distinguish clearly between Hamas and hummus, and before Ted Cruz was leading Trump in an Iowa poll with Marco Rubio at his heels. That was the context leading into last night. The undercard debate began with a barrage against Trump, George Pataki firing first, saying it was wrong of him to demonize millions of Muslims. Lindsey Graham, who dominated the debate, warned that Trump had done just what ISIS wants, declared war on Islam. And then in a sort of unofficial apology, said that Trump does not speak for America. And about Trump's calling for the execution of Sergeant Bo Bergdahl, who is charged with desertion in Afghanistan, Graham got applause for this put-down.
Mr. Trump, you don't have to speak about everything. It's not required.
Then the undercard developed into a debate about who would be toughest on terrorists, Syrian refugees, Russia, Iran, and Hillary Clinton. 2 hours later, the primetime debate had all that and more. The big news came from Trump in answer to a question from moderator Hugh Hewitt.
Are you ready to reassure Republicans tonight that you will run as a Republican and abide by the decision of the Republicans?
I really am. I'll be honest. I really am. I mean, people have been putting me to question. I really am.
I can applaud.
This was certainly a relief to Republicans who feared Trump would deliver the White House to the Democrats if he were to run as an independent. But of course, many Republicans place their hopes not with Trump, but with one of two young senators. And the Ted Cruz-Marco Rubio rivalry became florid last night. Cruz repeatedly questioned Rubio's conservative credentials, his positions on national security and on immigration.
He has attempted to muddy the waters, but I think anyone that watched the battle that we had, there was a time for choosing, as Reagan put it, where there was a battle over amnesty, and some chose, like Senator Rubio, to stand with Barack Obama and Chuck Schumer and support a massive amnesty plan. Others chose to stand with Jeff Sessions and Steve King and the American people and secure the border. And let me mention, this issue is actually directly connected to what we've been talking about, because the front line with ISIS isn't just in Iraq and Syria, it's also in Kennedy Airport and the Rio Grande. Border security is national security.
A couple points. In 2013, we had never faced a crisis like the Syrian refugee crisis now. Up until that point, a refugee meant someone fleeing oppression, fleeing communism, like it is in my community. As far as Ted's record, I'm always puzzled by his attack on this issue. Ted, you support legalizing people who are in this country illegally. Ted Cruz supported a 500% increase in the number of H-1B visas, the guest workers that are allowed into this country, and Ted supports doubling the number of green cards. So I think what's important for us to understand is there is a way forward on this issue that we can bring our country together on. And when I'm president, I will do it. And it will begin by bringing illegal immigration under control and proving it to the American people.
Now, all this beltway talk between senators about legislation gave Washington outsider Governor Chris Christie an opening he could drive a truck through.
If your eyes are glazing over like mine, this is what it's like to be on the floor of the United States Senate. I mean, endless debates about how many angels on the head of a pin from people who've never had to make a consequential decision in an executive position. The fact is, for 7 years, I had to make these decisions after 9/11. Make a decision about how to proceed forward with an investigation or how to pull back, whether to use certain actionable intelligence or whether not to. And yet they continue to debate about this bill and in the subcommittee and what. Nobody in America cares about that. What they care about is, are we going to have a president who actually knows what they're doing to make these decisions?
Jeb Bush was forceful last night, too, relatively, saying Trump couldn't insult his way into the presidency and that leadership is not about scaring voters, but about creating a serious strategy. Trump dismissed this, and Jeb having called him unhinged, suggesting Bush would say anything to lift his low poll numbers, which leads us to asking just who is gaining on whom and by how much. Yes, time for the horse race when we crunch the data. Overnight, the betting odds on who will win the Republican nomination confirmed what many see as a narrowing field of Trump, Cruz, and Rubio. Rubio is still the favorite. But since we last looked, Ted Cruz has now moved comfortably ahead of Trump and is in second place. Betting odds are becoming a more reliable metric as Betfair quickly approaches $1 million in actual bets on each party's nominees. The betting market isn't alone in considering Rubio the frontrunner. According to Nate Silver's 538 team, Rubio was targeted by his fellow Republicans almost as much as Clinton last night. The upside for Rubio is that the attacks gave him more TV time across both the main event and the undercard. Rubio was referenced negatively 22 times, slightly behind Hillary, who was attacked on 29 occasions. Trump was only the fourth most criticized candidate at 16 on the main stage. The attacks against Trump came later in the evening as that debate went on and helped him come from behind to gain back some of the spotlight. He was near invisible in the first half of the debate and avoided some of the confrontation as more wonky policy differences were hashed out among other candidates. This was likely a relief to Trump, as he tends not to fare well in polls following a debate. The time between debates is where Trump shines and other candidates struggle for attention in the media. All right, time to discuss the issues and their subtext with one of this country's leading public intellectuals, Cornel West. Dr. West is author of Race Matters and Democracy Matters, and author of many books, including his latest, Black Prophetic Fire. He has taught at Harvard and Princeton and the University of Paris, and is currently professor of philosophy and Christian practice at the Union Theological Seminary in New York City. Welcome.
Always a blessing to be with you, though, brother. You still the best. You still the best.
You're very kind.
Yeah.
So why are you supporting Bernie Sanders?
Well, I tell you, brother Bernie Sanders, he's one of the last exemplars of integrity in public life. I think we all, as a country, have to recognize that we're in deep trouble when it comes to moral and spiritual witness, when it comes to truth bearing, when it comes to truth telling. And to have someone who's not perfect but tells the truth from his gut, soul, and is concerned about working in poor people is in no way in the back pocket of corporate America.
He doesn't have a lot of experience coming from Vermont, governing for diversity, governing among diversity. He doesn't often sound as comfortable as Hillary Clinton does, I think it's fair to say, speaking the language of diversity. Would you say?
Well, I would say that he's certainly one who has not mastered the PR discourse. And by PR, I mean public relation discourse. And that's exactly what we often see among the mainstream politicians, because we're experiencing the collapse of establishment in both parties. The Republican establishment is going under, and you can see the parties having a nervous breakdown. It's moving much more authoritarian, right-wing populist, shades of fascism beginning to surface. But in the Democratic Party, not a lot of focus yet, but the establishment in the Democratic Party is also under relative collapse. And the Clinton machine, though seemingly strong, when you scratch real quickly, you see it's in deep trouble. And who's left? Brother Bernie Sanders, representing working and poor people at his best.
And yet there's an irony this year, which is that when you look at the two candidates, or even if you include Martin O'Malley on the Democratic side, three white people, look who's out front for the Republicans: Marco Rubio, Ted Cruz, Ben Carson, though he's fading, a black man, two Latinos, as well as, of course, Donald Trump. What does that tell us? Anything at all?
Well, I think we know from dear brother Barack Obama that it's never going to be a function of skin pigmentation translating into progressive politics. You got a black politics, a black president. Black child poverty is higher now than it was before he took over. So it doesn't translate in the way in which we would like it to translate. And similarly so, I think these days, there's no doubt that when black Americans, for example, get a chance to take a close look at Bernie Sanders, they'll see, in fact, that it's much better to have a Bernie Sanders than to have a neoliberal black, let alone a Clarence Thomas. So in that sense, we're beginning to mature and say, no, we're concerned about the character and the judgments made of politicians. And I think when Bernie Sanders is known more in the country, not just by black folk, but across the board, people begin to see he is the real thing. Those concerned about bringing the country together, but not bringing the country together in the middle line. See, that's Machiavellian calculation.
Middle line.
The middle line is just compromise with no principle, which is opportunism. He is prudential. It's very different. Prudential is you have your ideals, you have a sense of who you are, but you have to make tough choices.
Does it say anything positive or encouraging about the Republican electorate, that for all we ascribe racism to some of the things that are going on this year, that they're willing to put Ben Carson in first place for a while until he seemed incompetent on foreign policy, willing to put Marco Rubio and Ted Cruz as high as they are?
Well, I think what you have, though, let's say somebody like Brother Dr. Ben Carson, though, he's willing to use the same right-wing language that the other candidates are willing to use, even though he's black and brilliant and beautiful. So he's just as wrong as they are. And again, it's a matter of maturity, political maturity, being able to keep track of their judgment, just not the color of their skin. And so when the crucial issues, for example, of criminal justice system, look what's happening in Chicago right now with Rahm Emanuel. Did he cover up? Did he lie? Well, Hillary Clinton said she has great confidence. Well, Bernie Sanders campaigned for Chuy Garcia, and many of us campaigned for Chuy Garcia against Rahm Emanuel. Why? It had nothing to do with ethnicity, had to do with him being wrong and on the wrong side. Barack Obama said Rahm Emanuel is what? My boy. Oh, he's your boy, and he's going to hide and conceal all of this police brutality, and this is not new in the history of Rahm Emanuel. So when it comes to those kinds of issues, the question is, what is the quality of the character of the candidate?
In this fifth Republican debate, they didn't talk about race. I don't know if the word was mentioned even once. Did you see race as a subtext?
Well, I think in some ways race is a subtext when it comes to foreign policy, because it's hard to keep track of the value of precious Muslim lives. And oftentimes those Muslim lives are chocolate, maybe not black in the American sense, but chocolate in the broader sense. You know, we don't want to talk about the fact that we've had almost 1.5 million deaths as a result of invaders and occupations and drones dropping bombs on precious brown peoples. That sets a context for the fascism of ISIS, the viciousness of Al-Qaeda. So we have to be anti-fascist, and in that sense, yes, we've got to be anti-ISIS all the way down, but we also have to be anti-imperialist in terms of keeping track of the policies of the U.S. empire. And there's no doubt 2001 with occupation, invasion, the shattering of a state, shattering of the Libyan state, shattering of Syria, what's going on in Bahrain, what is going on, of course, with the drones in Yemen and Pakistan and Afghanistan. So when you have 1.5 million precious Muslim lives, they've got priceless brothers and sisters and wives and husbands and cousins. And unfortunately, you don't get a progressive response, you get this fascist response of ISIS. And so, yes, we got to keep track and be very, very vigilant against fascism in every form, but I'm also against any of the fascist policies, even when it's from my own country. We have to be morally consistent.
Define that word, fascist?
Fascism. Fascism is the massive and institutionalized disregard of lives. It's the subordination and domination of peoples across the board with a small elite dictating the destiny of a social project. And it comes in a variety of different forms. And I think even in our internal situation here, you know that wonderful novel by Sinclair Lewis in 1935, It Can't Happen Here, The Rise of American Fascism. The people thought it was a novel about Huey Long at that time. But what we're really talking about was what happens when a vast number of people feel despair, alienation, marginalized, feeling as if they're helpless, and here comes a strong man projecting some sense of greatness, some grand destiny for a nation, but only following him as he engages in massive arbitrary use of power or engages in language that calls for massive arbitrary use of power. That's fascist project.
I've been reading the new book by your colleague when you were at Princeton, Eddie Glaude.
Oh, yes, Democracy in Black.
And he calls for what he labels a blank out. You probably know this already,
Yes,
which is
yeah.
to have black people next year go to the polls in large numbers and then not vote. Do you like that idea?
Well, I want him to vote for Brother Bernie Sanders because I think what's going to happen is that Brother Bernie is going to surprise people. The corporate media has been unfair to him. 81 minutes for Trump, he gets 1 minute. Trump has a Twitter in the middle of the night, they have a seminar the next morning. He's laying out issues laying out policies relating to issues, hard to get the kind of corporate media attention. But when you go on social media, what do you see? Sanders triumphs. Why? Because there you've got people who are really interested in the issues. And so in that sense, and I think Brother Eddie would agree, he and I are teaching a seminar at Princeton actually in the fall. I have great love and respect for Brother Eddie. But if it's a choice between Sanders or Trump, Sanders or Cruz, Sanders or Rubio, I think he's going to choose Sanders. I think he's going to change his mind. But his point is to try to get black people to wake up as opposed to this sleepwalking under neoliberal Barack Obama. And I agree with that wholeheartedly.
Now stay here. We're going to bring in some evidence, and I want to get your reaction.
Indeed, indeed.
Time for Evidence-Based Politics, where we meet a scholar who has studied an issue oversimplified by campaign rhetoric. Right now, the news is all about ISIS and refugees, but one major project of the Obama administration will likely reemerge as a campaign issue: the proposed 12-nation trade deal, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or TPP agreement. It was drafted without Congress weighing in, but now it's in their hands to vote it up or down. The deal would open up trade among Pacific Rim countries, including those in the Americas and in Asia, either side of the Pacific: Canada, Mexico, Peru, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, Vietnam, Malaysia, and the U.S., and a few others, notably not China, not India. Critics say TPP would harm the environment, run up prices on products like pharmaceuticals, and lower labor standards. Since the text was made public in October, it's been called a giveaway to corporations. President Obama says it's imperfect, but should be supported.
We strive to make sure our own economy lives up to high standards. But in a lot of parts of the world, the rules are unfair. The playing field is uneven. That puts American businesses and American workers at a disadvantage. So the question is, what should we do about it? Some folks think we should just withdraw and not even try to engage in trade with these countries. I disagree. We have to make sure America writes the rules of the global economy.
Breaking with the White House, many Democrats oppose the TPP, including Hillary Clinton, despite having called it the gold standard earlier. And now it's under attack by Republicans like House Speaker Paul Ryan, who says it will hurt the cheese industry in Wisconsin. So Trans-Pacific Partnership, New Paradigm, or Wolf in Sheep's Clothing. That was the title of our next guest's 2011 paper on TPP, and she's been studying it ever since. Joining us on Skype from Buffalo, New York, Meredith Lewis, director of the Cross-Border Legal Study Center at the SUNY Buffalo Law School. Thank you very much for joining us. Hi.
Hi, thanks for having me.
And I was reading some of your older work. I see that as far back as 2011, you wrote about the need for the TPP to diverge from past trade deals to be more liberal. What did you have in mind then, and how has the final version come out?
Well, as you may have discussed on the program before, the TPP concept grew out of a trade agreement that was entered into by Chile, New Zealand, Brunei, and Singapore back in 2005. And unlike most other free trade agreements, that agreement had almost universal coverage in terms of trade in goods, reducing tariffs to zero on just about all goods. Whereas most free trade agreements have excluded the agricultural sector or the textile sector. And so when the TPP concept was first launched, the idea was there would be an expansion of this earlier agreement. What has happened over time is as different interest groups have weighed in and more parties have joined the agreement, it has not been as comprehensive as was once envisioned.
So do you think that when Hillary Clinton called it the gold standard when it was in development, and now she's decided not to support it, that she's not just politically posturing because things really have deteriorated in the text since the earlier drafts in terms of labor standards, environmental standards, and things like that?
No, I don't think so. I think that the ways in which the conception of the agreement have changed over time actually, I would think, would be changes that Secretary Clinton would consider favorable. So, for example, in 2010 or whenever it was that she expressed the positive sentiments about the TPP, at that time, the U.S. was seeking, as it did throughout the negotiations, heightened intellectual property protections on pharmaceuticals. In the final deal, much to the chagrin of Republicans, what was agreed on for protection of pharmaceuticals was much less than what the administration has sought. And I would have thought that Secretary Clinton would consider that a positive.
How quickly they could go to generics. So what should we think about the objection of Paul Ryan over it being bad for the Wisconsin cheese industry? Is that an example of something larger in trade deals in general?
Well, I haven't seen that specific statement. I saw that as recently as yesterday, he said that if there were enough good things in the agreement, he would push for a quick vote. And he was, of course, very supportive of Trade Promotion Authority over the summer. So I'm a bit skeptical if the suggestion is that he's suddenly opposed to the agreement. But in general, there were very few, very minor concessions made by the United States on dairy, whereas the U.S. will actually get more market access in some of the other countries for dairy, not necessarily because the markets were liberalized hugely, but because other of our trading partners in the TPP already have free trade agreements with some of those countries and therefore already have preferential tariff access, and we will now get the same access that they have.
Dr. West, I see a question forming in your brain.
I've got a question from Sister Lewis, namely the relation between process and product. Why did the process have to remain so secretive and clandestine, with seemingly more corporate voices being heard than those of working people and poor people? And I think there is a connection between process and product, and people are going to be suspicious of a product when the process seems to be so hard for certain voices to be heard in shaping it.
My perception from having followed free trade agreement negotiations for a number of years is that this deal was negotiated just as all the others have been. Now, that may be a cause for universal criticism.
Exactly. The critique just holds across the board when it comes to elite formation of these policies. Go right ahead, though.
But I don't really see this as any different. I think the reason that this got a lot of attention was because this agreement is larger than any other free trade agreement that has ever been negotiated outside of the WTO.
Could you tell me why China and India are not in it? Obviously, a third of the world's population right there. And when we think of Asia, an agreement with Asia, those are the two first countries that would come to mind. But the president keeps saying this is in part to prevent China from forming its own Pacific partnership that it leads. What's that alternative scenario, and why can't we have them on board with us?
Well, at the moment, there is a different trade agreement being negotiated called the Regional, I always get this wrong, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which is the 10 members of ASEAN, China, India, Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand. So China is negotiating quite a large Asian trade deal right now. The difference between it and the TPP, however, is ambition. So the TPP, although not as pure, in quotes, as the precursor agreement, it is still much more trade liberalizing than the China alternative agreement is going to be. The reason not to have India, for example, in the TPP is that India has really not been willing to lower tariffs on its products comprehensively or to take on things like binding labor standards or environmental standards. So India just would not be willing to agree to the terms.
And so the U.S. is hoping that this becomes the norm in most of Asia, and then India is kind of forced to join that kind of a system. Dr. West, why the disconnect between most progressives in and out of Congress and President Obama on this?
There is a disconnect between President Obama's progressive rhetoric at times and his neoliberal practice. When it comes to bailing out Wall Street rather than Main Street, that's not real policies that empower working people. That would be just one example. And I think when it comes to the trade, the history of international trade, as Sister Lewis noted, is not one in which Congress, voice of people, let alone working people and poor people on the outside. It's an elite formation in which neoliberal and conservative voices are at the center. Those are the kinds of issues that are raised, I think, by progressives. And Obama is disclosed to be the neoliberal that he really is when it comes to policy and practice.
So
and I don't know whether, Sister Lewis, is that fair or unfair or what?
Well, I guess I have a slightly different take. I consider myself to be progressive, and I'm a Democrat, but I am pro-free trade, so that may explode your mind. The U.S. has required investor-state dispute settlement in most of its free trade agreements for a long time. And again, just like the negotiation of the agreement, this got very, very little attention from the public because they didn't know about it or they didn't think it was important. Now, the reason those clauses have traditionally been included in free trade agreements is to protect the investing countries' companies from biased treatment in another country. So if in the case of TPP, if a U.S. company is doing business in Vietnam, it goes south, that the U.S. company will get a fairer shake in arbitration than going to Vietnamese courts. That's the theory. I personally think that that's probably a good idea when you're talking about the U.S. and Vietnam. Now, do we need it between the U.S. and Australia? Well, actually, in the U.S.-Australia free trade agreement, we didn't include it.
Thank you so much for joining us
Sure, my
and
pleasure.
explaining your scholarly look over the years and in the present day at trade and the TPP in particular. And Dr. West, to wrap it up by bringing it back to the presidential race,
Yes.
there used to be, I think, a coalition that would have included the labor unions and who we now consider the Trump supporters on both opposing these so-called free trade agreements, which Trump opposes, and opposing massive immigration on the same basis that it brings in a lot of low paid wage earners who will compete with the existing labor force, including some studies have found that African Americans, lower educated African Americans, are among the main victims of massive, low education immigration.
Yeah, yeah.
But that has split now. Now it's considered, progressive and pro-union to be for immigration but against trade. We have a minute left. Why don't the two meet anymore?
Well, one, I think in the past you had a trade union movement that was positive in terms of trying to bring workers together, but it had a xenophobic element. It was still racist. So it was anti-brown, anti-black too often. Whereas, thank God, we've now got leadership in the trade union movement in which they embrace black and brown, including our precious immigrants who are coming into the country trying to make a way for themselves. On the other hand, there's a consistency in terms of the secretive trade deals made at the top with politicians who are either in cahoots with big money or even colonized by corporate power and therefore see themselves beholden to those powers. And that's part of the critique of the Larry Cohens and others, the progressives within the trade union movement, who are on Brother Bernie Sanders' bandwagon with myself and Nina Turner and a host of others.
And the debate continues.
It
Thank you
does.
so very
Thank you
much.
so much, though, brother.
Appreciate it
Always
a lot.
blessing.
And that's
Always a
POTUS
blessing.
2016 for today. We're here each week covering the presidential horse race and inviting scholars to pour cold, hard facts on the overheated campaign rhetoric. The next debate is among the Democratic contenders. That's this Saturday, December 19th. We'll be here again this time next week. I'm Brian Lehrer. Thanks for watching.